Hi everybody, welcome back to episode 7 of my Dodge Raider rebuild project. Got a few things done this week. Had some parts come in for the suspension and the brakes. So I spent some time reconditioning the brake calipers and installing some brake parts, rotors, and brake pads, calipers. And then I also installed the new shocks and cleaned up and repacked the automatic four-wheel drive hubs. Took them apart and looked at them. They looked like they were in really good shape. Nothing needed to be replaced. So I cleaned them up with some gasoline, got all the old grease out of them, and repacked them with new grease. Put them back on. They work fine. You can rotate them by hand and watch them engage. Watch the claws sink into the hub and grab, so they work good. All right, I'm cleaning some brake parts tonight. We're going to scrub these up, fix and paint a few of the items, probably a stainless steel or a cast steel color, and then we're going to rebuild them, pull these apart and put the new seals in them. Just using some hot soapy water. So I am repairing these calipers by replacing the rubber components, the seal in the back of the piston here. What you do is you squeeze the piston in with a C-clamp and pry out the boot that goes on top. This keeps the dust out of it. There's a ring and a boot here. And then next we're going to apply some air pressure to the inlet here to push this piston all the way out. You want to keep your fingers clear, put a piece of cloth or something in here so it doesn't scar anything up. Put the air on there, blow the piston out. That's what we'll work on next. Okay, wear your safety glasses at all times whenever you're dealing with high pressure air. You don't want to blow anything into your eyeballs. If you have any little O-rings floating around, you can throw an O-ring on the end of this, tighten up the seal. You can see how that completely blew out of there. And if you'd had your finger in that, you would have caused some damage. So after we honed out this cylinder, it's looking pretty smooth in there. Cleaned it out with some brake cleaner. Next we're gonna sand down this piston a little bit, get rid of some of the rough sides here, and it really is just buildup. It isn't affecting the metal, it's just a buildup of old brake oil, fluid, and rubber and whatnot. I'm going to start here with some 320 grit for a few minutes, and then we'll go up to 600 to make it really smooth. Okay, as you can see here, this piston is completely smooth now, ready to be put back in, except for I've got a ding right here. And so I'm going to take care of that with a file and get rid of the high spot. I don't know how that happened, but it's got a nice little dent there, and I'm going to get rid of that right now. Okay, knocked down that high spot there, now it's perfectly smooth. So the new pieces for this caliper are the piston seal and the boot up top. And everything gets coated with grease, silicone grease. You're gonna coat the inside of these channels where the piston goes into. That'll keep a seal. And then we're gonna coat the piston in brake fluid before we slide it in. And there you have it. We finished one caliper. It's been cleaned up, and the piston has been repaired with a new seal kit, so it's ready to be put back on the car, and it will work perfectly. On to the next. Then I spent some time cleaning the passenger side of the suspension and putting that all together, and it turned out really nice. It looks like a fairly new suspension, with the exception of maybe some of the paint being chipped up. But at least all the mud and the grease is off of it. Looks like a better car now. I'm replacing the rubber grommets for the sway bar. The sway bar is this big thick bar here that counteracts roll. When you take a corner, your car wants to roll in one direction or the other, and that helps counteract it. Well, it's attached to the frame in two parts, one here, one over there, and then the ends of the anti-roll bar attached to the suspension right here. So I'm replacing the rubber components because they are definitely worn out. In fact, the ones on the suspension, you can see here, were completely smashed and not really effective. What that means is that at the very least you'll have more body roll when you take a corner, but you'll also get creaks and clicks and metallic sounds when parts of those suspension pieces are touching each other. So it just so happens that I have a kit, not necessarily for this car, but I will take off the rubber components out of this kit and replace them. And we'll be back up to good specs on this anti-roll bar. Cleaning the wheel bearings and a little bit of gasoline here. And once you get rid of all the grease, you want to just take a look at the bearing surfaces for any scarring or discoloration. Hairline, really fine hair lines are fine, especially if you can't feel them with your fingernail. But anything that's that you can feel, or pitting or discoloration, if it's all blue, then you want to replace these. But these look fine. Next, I'm going to clean up this automatic four-wheel drive unit, make sure that it works okay. Alright, we're working on this automatic hub lock assembly here for the passenger side. Took it apart per the instructions on the shop manual, and cleaned all the grease out of it, and I'm going to repack it with grease. It looks okay, I don't see any damage or worn out parts, so it looks okay. We're going to put it back together and put this back in the car. So I went ahead and bought a new set of rotors instead of turning the old rotors, because the prices of these have come down pretty dramatically. Turning the rotors was about $12 or $15 each, and buying a new set with the ceramic brake pads was only about 65 bucks. So I was only going to save about 15 bucks or 20 bucks having them turned. And the problem with turning rotors is that you get closer to that minimum thickness. And the closer you get to the minimum allowable thickness on rotors, the thinner they are, and they get hot faster when you're braking. So if you're coming up a freeway and you're braking and these things get hot, and you hit a mud puddle or rainwater gets on them, they tend to warp easier. And that's when you get that kind of that wobble when you're braking. It's a warped rotor. So just for the few extra dollars, it made sense to stay with as thick of rotor as we could get, and you'll have better braking performance. You won't have brake fade quite as bad. The brake fade is caused by them getting too hot and not being able to convert that forward momentum into heat. And on a side note, whenever you get a new set of rotors, be sure to clean them off with brake cleaner. They come with a light film of oil, and it's better not to have that in contact with your new brake pads. So after bolting the rotor onto the hub assembly, the next step is to grease up the bearings and put the seal on the back of this hub. So I don't have a bearing packer, I just do it by hand, and you just want to smash grease into the bearing assembly until it starts to come out the front. Use the palm of your hand, work it around, create a little bit of pressure into that groove until the grease starts to come out the front of the bearing. So when you tighten this hub assembly on here, you put it onto the spindle, put on your main locking nut, and you tighten it down to 100 foot-pounds, and then back it off to 0, tighten again to 18 foot-pounds, and then back it off a 30-degree turn. And that's to get the proper amount of tension on that bearing. And then there's a locking washer that locks that nut because it isn't super tight, it's fairly loose. So to keep it from moving around, there's a locking washer with some screws. Keeps it in place. So before I hook those brakes up to the calipers down there, I'm just blowing out any excess old brake fluid out of the lines, just so that old gunky brake fluid, if it is old, doesn't get into the new rebuilt calipers. Alright, we have our new brake pads that came in this week. Okay, these brake pads slide into the brackets on the wheel. However, you do want to add some of this synthetic grease. It's a vibration grease. Any of the surfaces that touch the brake pads, such as the calipers and the brackets, need to have a little bit of grease on it. It keeps them from squealing under certain situations. Nobody knows how it works, but they've been using it for thousands of years. So you just wanted to put it around the piston surface that touches that side of the brake pad, and then the two arms on this side. And then I also like to put it on the feet that grab the bracket. Okay, we had some more parts come in this week. We had tie rod ends for the steering linkage. I went ahead and bought a set of tie rod ends for both the passenger and the driver's side, because these ball joints here are clearly shot. You can grab them and they move around, so they're worn out. And since these are fairly cheap, I think all four of them, inner and outer tie rod ends on both the passenger and driver's side, I think all four of them was like less than 40 bucks, $38 or something. So it was not very expensive. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure these so I can get them close when I put them back together with the new ones. We're going to reuse the center section, and you undo the lock nuts and then screw them out. But you want to get them close, especially if you're not going to have the car aligned anytime soon, realigned, which I probably will, but for the time being, if you get them close, they'll be fine for a few miles. So here you can see that the passenger side suspension is pretty much done. I rebuilt or cleaned out and repacked the four-wheel drive auto clutch up here. New rotors and brake pads. Reconditioned the calipers. And then we have new brake hoses, new shocks, new tie rod ends fore and aft. And then I scoured the whole suspension down with soap and water so that it is clean and degreased and perfectly ready to be worked on. If you want to get under there and tinker, it's not a greasy mess. You can compare this side of the suspension with the driver's side, which I haven't worked on yet, and is a complete nasty mess. And I also worked a bit on the transmission, trying to figure out what to do about that leak. I don't know if it is a leak or not. I'm suspecting it was leaking a little bit out of the seal, but it isn't dripping at all now, so it may have just been a little bit of oil buildup from the rear main seal, or from when I was cleaning the engine bay. Some of the cleaning solution may have just gotten in the bell housing and I took it as a leak, so I don't know. Alright, so here's the issue I'm looking at right now. This transmission fluid pump appeared to be leaking a little bit. It was pooling right down here, but I'm not 100% sure if it was coming out of the transmission or if it was coming out of the motor before I took it apart. So I bought a seal, an O-ring, to replace this. You pull this pump off and you can put an O-ring around here, and you also have to deal with these bolts. Sometimes they need to have a sealant around them, and it looks like whoever worked on this has packed sealant in here. Now the problem I'm having is these do not look like the stock bolts, because they've come in here and ground down the bolt heads almost to the point where you can't undo them. The sockets barely fit on these bolt heads. So that tells me that they were into it, whoever had it before me, and they did some work in here and they put different bolts in. So what concerns me with the bolts I was just showing you in that transmission is that I found a bolt up here in the timing chain area that was the wrong bolt that they had ground down the head, and it was a imperial bolt or standard into a metric motor, and it was misthread. Then I found they did the same thing on the torque converter. Misthread, stripped out the torque converter bolts with imperial bolts. They did the same thing on the crank. Stripped out most of the crank bolts with not metric bolts but imperial or standard bolts. So now I'm thinking they may have jammed in a bunch of regular American-made bolts into that transmission and perhaps could have stripped them. But I can't tell. I've tried taking off 2 bolts and the sockets barely get any grasp on that bolt head and they're not coming off. So now to decide whether to pull the transmission out, tear it apart and figure out what happened in there, or to just risk it, put it back together and see if it leaks. We'll see. So there you have it. That's the latest update on this Project Raider. Coming up on Christmas here in about a week and a half. So I don't know how much time I'll be spending out here over the next few days, but whatever I do work on, I will film, and we'll get something up before the holidays, hopefully. Otherwise, have a great Christmas, and we will catch you guys later. Bye.